Hey humans, Tim here, and you're listening to our first episode in our first season of More Than Human. We created this podcast because we wanted to explore those interesting and porous boundaries between the human and non-human, the things we share with the other species, ecologies, geologies, and more of planet Earth. The things that make us question what makes us uniquely human and where we fit in this incredible and complex world. Each episode, we'll introduce you to the individuals, groups, and organisations redefining our relationship with the natural world, challenging us to interrogate our worldviews and relationships with the more than human. If you want to know more about what inspired this podcast, I recommend you go back and listen to our introduction episode. I talk a little more about myself there too. When I was planning this series, one of the stories that immediately stood out was the acknowledgement in legislation in 2017 that the Yarra River, or Birrarung, the main river that runs through the city of Melbourne, is one integrated living entity.
On behalf of all members, can I extend a very warm welcome to all of our Wurundjeri elders onto the floor of the chamber. I now invite Wurundjeri elder Auntie Alice Kalasa to address the House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To everyone present, we say, Woman-jika, Wurundjeri Balak, Yemen Kundibik. Welcome to our country. Today we gather proudly on this historic occasion, not only for us, the Woi-wurrung people, but for all Victorian Aboriginal clans and the state of Victoria. Today a bill comes before the House to protect and recognise the Birrarung. In our language, Woi-wurrung, this bill is called Willip Gin Birrarung Maron, which means keep the Birrarung alive. The Birrarung has been central to our cultural, spiritual, social and economic well-being since the dreaming. Our ancestors and the Birrarung shaped one another, living in balance together for countless generations. The state now recognises something that we, as the first people, have always known, that the Birrarung is one integrated living entity. When passed, this bill will guarantee that the Birrarung will be protected by law and benefit from the custodianship of a body known as the Birrarung Council.
Birrarung is the river's name in the language of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung, the traditional owners of a large part of the river's range. This name translates to River of Mists and Shadows. On a cold Melbourne morning, you can still see the river rising to reclaim the city, immersing it in fog. Birrarung is the name we'll mostly use to refer to the river throughout the season. Mark, our co-producer, and I had initially planned to produce 1 or 2 episodes, exploring this idea of living entity and how it ties to the global rights of nature movement. However, in the process of conducting the first round of interviews in August and September of 2025, it quickly became evident that there's a lot more to this story, and doing it justice would require more than just 60 minutes of podcast time. 2017 might sound like old news, but the ripples of that decision have become waves influencing change even as we release this episode and record this season. So, while it's impossible to cover everything and everyone involved, this is episode 1 of several we'll be releasing over the coming months. Across this series, we'll be diving into what it means for a river to be alive, how that came to be recognised in the case of Birrarung, how it ties to global movements to redefine our relationship with rivers and natural entities, and who's involved. I'll be learning alongside you as we meet the people who work closely with the river and have formed intimate relationships of their own, some of them new and some spanning countless generations. Welcome to the More Than Human world and our first series, Living with Birrarung. This is episode 1, To Be Alive.
It's got personalities. If we look at the fast-flowing, oxygenated, bubbly parts of the headwater past Warburton, you get to the sluggish parts around Warrandyte, and then you get down to, Dytes Falls, and it's bubbling again. But then it changes again, because then it's part of a tidal system.
That was the voice of Uncle Andrew Gardiner, a Wurundjeri elder describing Birrarung. The Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung are the traditional owners of most of the area surrounding Birrarung, including where I'm recording this from Melbourne's outer northern suburbs. The city is also known as Naarm in the languages of the Woi-wurrung and Boonwurrung people. As with Birrarung, you might hear that name used interchangeably by me and the various guests throughout the season. We'll be hearing again from Uncle Andrew several times. Birrarung is central to the geography, ecology and cultural life of Melbourne. Its clear waters begin in the upper reaches of Mount Baw to the city's east, flowing through forest and farmland via the Upper Yarra Reservoir, gradually becoming wider. The river is slow and brown as it runs through the middle of the city, passing iconic locations like the Melbourne Cricket Ground and Flinders Street Station, before emptying into Port Phillip Bay. It's a journey of 242 kilometres, collecting runoff from half of metropolitan Melbourne on the way and providing 70% of the city's drinking water. Most Melburnians walk or commute alongside or over Birrarung every day, but how many of us would look at the murky flow and think of it as alive?
So the idea of the Birrarung as a living entity challenges a lot of the way that I used to work, I suppose.
This is Emma Barnett. Emma is the Community Engagement and Education Officer with the Yarra Riverkeeper Association.
I have a degree in ecology and conservation biology and conservation genetics. And in my undergraduate studies in biology, we do learn that evolutionarily humans aren't at the top with all other living beings below us, and that we're relatively new to the scene. But the way of teaching that I found at uni was still very much within a colonial system. Conservation was still with a very colonial mindset. Our idea of conservation through national parks, having these sort of living museums for our enjoyment. And there's not the idea of this kind of reciprocal relationship with nature.
I met up with Emma at a local library to chat about her experience incorporating the idea of a living river into her work with the community. My toddler Robin was along for the ride, so you might hear him chatting in the background. I wanted to start with Emma's thoughts this episode, as I think there are several parallels with many of us who grew up and were educated in mainstream settler Australia, including me. My understanding of what life is was shaped by my high school biology classes. We were taught the acronym Mrs. Gren, which defines life via characteristics of movement, respiration, sensitivity, growth, reproduction, excretion, and nutrition. It's a prescriptive approach that describes animals and plants really well, but doesn't leave a lot of wiggle room for an entity like a river. The perception of science as a deliberately objective pursuit, where you observe from a safe distance and avoid interference with your subject, also didn't encourage the kind of reciprocal relationships that Emma described above. Relationships have a habit of messing with clean data. However, like many Australians, Emma also grew up with an appreciation for nature, but she's honest about the nature of that relationship.
I've always had an appreciation for nature. You know, I was a bushwalking kid and had lots of opportunities to be out and about. But it was always sort of what nature gives to me, you know, like mindfulness and relaxation and the services that it provides for me. So it was, you know, it's always been extractive in a way. A real turning point for me was when I did an exchange in Canada and I took a geography class with Juanita Sundberg.
Juanita Sundberg is an associate professor at the University of British Columbia and specialises in the intersection between politics, ecology, gender, and race. The more time I spent researching for this episode, the more I came across these consistent links between relational thinking towards nature and other political movements. I want to return to this in a later episode, as it's an important part of this story.
It happened to be 2017, which was a really pivotal year for the rights of nature movement. Juanita introduced this concept of a mountain or a river having personhood. And that really blew my mind because I had never thought about nature in that way.
I remember having a similar revelation for the first time reading US environmentalist and author Aldo Leopold's A Sand County Almanac. Leopold describes a way of approaching conservation and relationships with nature on an ecological and geological timescale, taking time to observe the connectedness of all things and consider the landscape from the perspective of a mountain, across spatial and temporal dimensions.
And the more I thought about it, the more it became clear that of course a mountain could be a person, or a river could be a person. And of course a river has the right to exist. And we're not the only beings that live around a river. And that sort of was sleeping for a while I finished my degree and then went off to work in an adaptive evolution lab. But when I came back, when I came into this role at the Yarra Riverkeeper Association, that was ignited in me again as I started learning more about the Birrarung as a living entity. And it was like, oh, that thing that was like so life-changing and inspiring, it was all coming back. And then I revisited some of Juanita's work. And that really changed my perspective, because then I started thinking of the short-finned eel, or the euk, and how that is a major actor, and how that eel has shaped cultures and waterways and life for us and for many other beings. It really opened my eyes to a different way of looking at nature and being with more than human beings.
These ideas aren't new to the Australian continent. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders have lived here for at least 60,000 years. Their worldviews, while diverse and adaptive across hundreds of nations and cultures, have always acknowledged country as having agency and a relationship with its inhabitants. Similar ideas proliferate in Indigenous cultures around the world. However, for those of us who have grown up in colonial settler societies, especially in urban environments, the journey to rediscovering this relationship is not straightforward. There's a tension, or as Emma puts it,
I feel there is still a lot of resistance within me, and I'm trying to be with the river in that way. So one of my practices now is that I do a lot of work on the river, like around the river with community engagement. So I spend, 20 minutes being with the river as a way to sort of break down some of those hard to articulate perspectives that are just deep within. I've lived a lifetime of viewing the river in one way, and it's not changing overnight. I believe in the river as a living entity, but I can't honestly say that yes, I feel it in my heart as well, but there's something there that there are things missing, and I'm looking for those. And I feel very late to this realization when I read about traditional owners' relationship with the Birrarung. I'm trying to learn.
There is a familiar hesitancy in the way Emma speaks honestly about her relationship with Birrarung. I recognise it in my own troubled journey towards better relations with the river, and in trying to understand it as a living entity. I was born in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and moved to Australia with my family when I was very young. Despite this, the rivers I remember admiring as a child during trips back to visit family were very different from Birrarung. They were wide, gravel-bed, braided rivers, sometimes glacial blue and still, sometimes snow-white and ferocious. They wandered across the landscape, always different with every visit. They were cold, they were clear, and they were swimmable. I have fond memories of being present with these rivers, It's easy for me to think of them as living, as companions and agents in my own life. I admit, in comparison, for a long time I looked at Birrarung with disdain. It appeared sluggish, dirty, and without the animated agency of the rivers in the country of my birth. I can't remember ever swimming in Birrarung. For a long time, like the old saying about forests and trees, I haven't been able to see the river for the water. It has taken me a long time to begin to deconstruct this way of thinking, to appreciate Birrarung for its own intrinsic value and unique character. I want to know how to build a better and lasting relationship with this river. And it just so happens I spoke with a lot of people much further along in this journey than me who can help.
I think in terms of living entity, there's so many different ways into that.
This is Dr. Erin O'Donnell. Along with Uncle Andrew Gardiner, she's a member of the Birrarung Council, a body tasked with speaking with Birrarung to provide oversight and guidance on the delivery of the Yarra Strategic Plan, also known as Burned-up Birrarung, Burned-up Umaku. What is good for Birrarung is good for all, in Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung language. I caught up with Erin and Uncle Andrew right after a Birrarung Council meeting in August of 2025. We'll get into the council, the strategic plan and more next episode. For now, Erin had some great advice for those wanting to make sense of a river as a living entity, especially those approaching this idea for the first time.
I see a lot of settler people really struggling with this idea, and so there's a few ways, I think, for people to start to make sense of it. The river clearly has agency. It's expressing itself and its personality. It's connecting with its lands. It's expanding and contracting. It is the mist that rises, that explores the air as well as the riparian zone and the city. From an ecosystem science perspective, it is a system. It is an embodied way of being. And so I think ecology is one way to think about the river as a living being. It is a system that is more than the sum of its parts. So that is a way that I've seen settler people come into this, because ecosystems and ecosystem science gives them a way to make sense of living being. And it taps into the kind of the older ideas of Gaia as the earth system, as being more than the sum of its parts.
So we can think of a river as alive by leaning into ideas of ecology and connectivity. This is like seeing the river as the central artery to a larger organism, an integrated and connected being that includes all the creatures, plants, fungi, soils, and other entities that rely on it for their own livelihoods, including us. This mass of life, this system stretching across the landscape, is the integrated living entity. Just as a body is more than the vascular system that carries oxygen to where it is needed, so a single living and integrated entity is more than just the water contained within the banks of a river.
A simpler way into this question of what is a living entity and how is the river alive is to think about the question in its inverse, which is, what is a dead river? If we turned off the flow, we'd very quickly see what a dead river looks like, and we see that in many places around the world. And people can articulate what a dead river is, and so therefore they know what a healthy living river looks like. I think our willingness to use words like dead, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, for instance, the engineers that put the dams on at the start of Wanganui and all of the other rivers in the region to funnel that water into the hydropower scheme, they called it beheading the river. So these were, in that case, Pākehā people, white people, settlers, who could use the language of killing a river. So we know what it means for a river to be alive. We just don't tend to talk about it in that way, but we certainly know what it looks like when we kill it.
So Erin offers us two ways into this idea of understanding a river as alive. First, our Western scientific understanding of ecology and connectivity, and second, by looking at the inverse, our clear understanding of what a dead river looks like. On that second point, I want to expand this idea of our language. English is also full of so many words linked to the idea of living waterways. We talk about bodies of water. A river has a mouth and headwaters. Birrarung itself is often referred to as the lifeblood of the city. The more I think about it, the more I realise how much our language of rivers is built around analogies to our own bodies. It's a theme that returned again and again in every interview I did for this show. Regarding connectivity, in the case of Birrarung, colonial society has spent the last 2 centuries modifying the river, impacting its ecology and connectivity to benefit our urban development and agricultural needs. The river might not be dead, but it is a very different river to that first seen by settlers, a river that meandered across the landscape collecting water from multiple tributaries and seasonally filling billabongs and other ephemeral swamps and lakes.
It's kind of easy to think about waterways as living because water moves, but really the whole landscape is living. I don't quite know how we address that, and I think addressing waterways as living entities is a big step forward.
This is Andrew Kelly, the convener of the Waterway Network and former Yarra Riverkeeper. I spoke to Andrew just after the launch of a new report on applying the living entity concept to the planning scheme in Melbourne. We're going to return to that part of the conversation in a later episode. But right now, Andrew had a lot to say about this idea of connectivity as it relates to a living river.
It's a step forward to think of the river as a living entity. And I mean, I think, though, my thinking is that the rivers are actually a series of living entities. They're not one, as far as I can make out. And that the landscape is a series of living entities. But I think there is something special about rivers. Rivers have something with the water flowing that is living and moves around in a sort of vital veins and arteries of the landscape, connecting, creating migration paths, opportunities for things to move up and down the river, particularly in times of climate change.
Veins and arteries. There it is again, that comparison to a body. But the conversation with Andrew took an interesting turn here. Comparing a river to a body can be helpful for understanding it as alive. It contextualizes it to our own experience. However, it also has its flaws. For one, in our Western mode of thinking, we're accustomed to seeing our bodies and ourselves as contained. We focus on individuals, and in doing so, we draw clear boundaries around where those individuals begin and end. This doesn't always work for an entity like a river.
We're going to need flexibility in the landscape, so the landscape can flex as things warm and sometimes get wetter and sometimes drier. So I think there's a tension there that we just have to acknowledge, accept, and go forward with, carrying it with us, that in a sense, the whole landscape. But I was thinking about it this morning before the interview, Tim, and I did think, well, in terms of people, we also have indeterminate boundaries. Hair is sort of less us because we get it cut than the rest of us in some ways. We have personal space that we say that, you're too close to me, you're in my personal space. I think we're probably a bit hung up on drawing tight boundaries, but there's not much else we can do given the system that we live in. It's a start to start drawing those boundaries, but the broader the boundaries, and the more we look at the river as connected entities, the more we look at, say, parklands dotted along the river and looking at the way we can connect up those parklands to deliver a healthier landscape, the better off we'll be, I think, both as traditional owners, although I can't speak for traditional owners, but certainly as a broader community.
So when we start talking about a river in our own languages, we need to be mindful of the imaginary boundaries we create with that language. And in the case of a river, we should try to make any necessary boundaries or definitions as broad as possible. This allows for that flex that Andrew mentioned earlier.
Uncle Glenn in Prayer for River talks about a river having, or water having memory. And certainly, the floods around Lismore, where traditional owners said, don't build there, you'll get flooded. And sure enough, people built there, and sure enough, they were flooded. And also around Gundagai was the same story. And I was recently on a tour of the Murray-Darling Basin. And the big issue at the Murray-Darling Basin really is that the floodwaters are no longer allowed to get through.
Like a phantom limb after an amputation, a river remembers where it used to flow. It also has the capacity to grow back. When there is enough water in the landscape, it floods and reclaims itself. At this point, I want to return to Uncle Andrew Gardiner. The interview with Uncle Andrew was one of the first I conducted for this series, and I was struck by how the knowledge he shared was reflected again and again in the interviews that followed. Indigenous cultures are still so often seen in the mainstream as historic, something of the past and something to look at through the lens of archaeology, museum pieces, or stories. But this is a clear demonstration that traditional owners' knowledge and worldviews, Their understanding of good relationships with the river and of the connectedness of country is not only relevant, but necessary if we are to respond collectively to the challenge of climate change.
The river as a living entity, well, it's a being because it is alive. It provides an environment for other creatures and other flora and fauna. So it's an environment itself, but it's also a living entity. It floods when it needs to. When it spreads itself across the landscape, it actually takes particles of goodness to those parts and actually replenishes those lands. So it sort of does a lot of things without it just being a water that travels past you. So there's different personalities, and it actually it acts differently in different parts. So, you know, as a living entity, as another being in a sense, we should be able to respect it by looking at it from that angle. Respect it more by damaging it less, putting less effluent into it, enabling it to be, you know, as good as it can be all the way to the sea, because there's better health mechanisms and it's doing it for us and we don't even know. So that personality is like I'm continuing to do this for people that are there. Now, it don't got a brain, so it's not actually thinking that purpose, but it naturally does stuff that's for our betterment. And it's been doing that same thing for thousands of years, yeah? It does remember, because when there's a king tide and that tide pushes back, there's push out, back up, you know, drainage lines and stuff. After Dietz Falls, not so bad, but it still has a memory to flood in those same places. It can be angry and it can be sad, it can be a bit slow and sluggish, it can be real bright and bubbly, but it's always giving. We don't give back to it enough.
It's this final point about giving back to the river that is part of the answer to the tension that Emma, me, and I suspect many others are feeling with this idea of a living river. Throughout this episode, we've been introduced to different ways of seeing the river as alive through ecology, connectedness, and relationships. But even if we get to the point of understanding this, what does it mean? If Birrarung is alive, if any river could be alive, can we really continue with business as usual in light of that new understanding? Emma spoke about the challenge of developing a relationship that wasn't purely extractive, about what a river could give to us. Uncle Andrew said we don't give back enough. Are we obliged to enter into something more reciprocal with Birrarung? Should this have always been the case? This is a fundamental challenge to our current systems.
I think the thing is the river has always been alive. I guess that's what the main thing I want to say, because I think we're now realizing that natural entities like rivers actually are alive. I think there's almost like a coming to realizing that ourselves when it's always been. And I think you see that Indigenous communities around the world have always known this, right?
This is Charity Mosianyane, the lead convener of the Swimmable Birrarung project at Regen Melbourne. We're going to hear more about their work later this season. We spoke as we walked along the Merri Creek, which is one of the creeks that flows into Birrarung. My conversation with Charity included this acknowledgement that this idea isn't new. We're coming into a realization that traditional owners already understand, as we've seen.
I think you see that Indigenous communities around the world have always known this, right? They know they're part of country. They know they are part and coexist in a live in reciprocity with country. And there's almost this beautiful partnership, not almost, there is this beautiful partnership and exchange in every day. And now I think it's fascinating seeing us come to this realization. Not everybody has come to this realization. We are learning to come to this realization saying, oh, actually, maybe we should stop and just, look at the river. Maybe we should stop and actually acknowledge these ducks that are swimming and floating on the river.
I love that Charity talks about curiosity here. When we first hear about new ideas, especially those that challenge our existing worldviews like a living river does, it can sound or feel like a lot of work. There can also be a lot of shame or grief in recognising past wrongs. But charity makes it sound exciting. Charity also directly challenged some of the biases I referred to earlier in this episode. My judgment of Birrarung based solely on what I could see.
There's maybe fish in there. Like there's a whole world unseen and seen that is being sustained by this river that we possibly go, oh, it's dirty, oh, I don't. But it's alive. Whether or not we have that connection to it, it's still alive. If this river was clear and we were seeing fish just jumping out of the waters and landing back in, and if we could see what was happening, we could probably say it was clean and it was healthy. But I think that the clarity of the water does not determine whether a river is clean or healthy. And I think there's this perception that we have to really, really manage. Like, I think about there's some rivers in New Zealand that are beautiful, crystal clear, but that does not mean they are clean.
This is true. Even though I grew up swimming in those rivers, and many still look familiar and clear, the impact of agriculture in New Zealand has severely polluted them. We'll return to this question of swimmable rivers in another episode. But for now, what do we take away from all of this? Well, that's what the rest of this season is about. We'll continue to explore different perspectives on Birrarung, and we'll be jumping feet first into conversations with community leaders, government agencies, academics, traditional owners and more to understand how different individuals and groups are responding to the tensions and challenges we've introduced in this episode. At the end of the day, as Erin puts it,
living entity focuses on relationships and it's invitational. It asks people to step into those relationships, to think about what a good relationship looks like. How do they create one? How do they recognise this living river as a being with whom they are in a relationship, rather than worrying about how the river is going to weaponise its rights against them, which is where legal personhood can very quickly take you.
We'll hear more from Erin in episode 2, as we explore the local and global significance of the Yarra Protection Act and living rivers in politics and law. For now, I want to give the final word to Emma Barnett. I think she sums up where my own curiosity has brought me by the close of this episode, and where it will hopefully take us across this season.
I hope that we can learn from traditional owners about how we can be with the more than human world, and how we can build a relationship, a personal relationship with the more than human world. I think that is what it's going to take to, I don't know how to say this without being like really dramatic, and it's a hard thing to articulate, but we are facing, huge ecological crisis. So we need to pick apart what got us here in the first place, and then we need to build a different way of being with our environment. And we all need to realize that we're not separate. Like we don't live in these sterile bubbles. Other beings are living and having rich and full lives all around us. I'm on this journey now, and I'm going to keep going and keep learning and building these relationships in the best way that I can.
In this episode, you heard from Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung elder Uncle Andrew Gardiner, Dr. Erin O'Donnell from the Birrarung Council and Melbourne Law School, Emma Barnett from the Yarra Riverkeeper Association, Andrew Kelly from the Waterway Alliance, and Charity Mosianyane from Regen Melbourne. You can find out more about our guests, their work and their organisations in the show notes or on our website, morethanhumanpod.net. More Than Human is an independent series produced by me, Tim McIntosh-Hanna, and Mark Spencer of Here Media. You can find out more about us and how you can support the podcast at morethanhumanpod.net. And as always, please subscribe and share this episode with everyone you know. Every new listener helps us grow. We'll be back next month with episode 2 in this season about Birrarung, life and law. If you've stuck around, I have a short postscript for you. Andrew Kelly is a published children's author, and Emma Barnett also does a lot of work with children in the community. I took the opportunity to ask them both about their thoughts on how children see the river. Do they see it more easily as alive?
Yes. I mean, I don't think children don't have much understanding of the sort of political complexity of chopping a river up into various statutory entities and council areas. They kind of see it as one thing. So it really does resonate with young children. I think they see I guess they see the river almost as a living thing. I don't know whether that articulated quite like that, but it has vibrancy and a life to it that maybe we as adults tend to overlook.
When I ask this question to children, is a river alive? Is the Birrarung alive? Most of them say, yes, the river is alive. And I ask why, and they say, well, it moves and it flows and there's living creatures within it. So I think that the river being alive is quite intuitive to younger people, and they still have great access to their imaginations and their creativity, so it's not a big stretch. But every now and then I do get a child who's very adamant that the river isn't alive because it's just water. And, what I say to that is, well, actually around 70% of the water that we drink in Melbourne comes from the Upper Yarra Reservoir. So, we're drinking that water is within us. Are we alive?